Welcome back to the Mugen Train Comparison Series. Things are really starting to heat up in episode 4 as this episode covers the rest of chapter 57 as well as chapter 58 and 59. Chapters that start to get into some very action-heavy territory. This episode is just the beginning. So without further ado, let's get started. Just like last episode, this one starts with a recap showing the events that led up to the end of chapter 57. But right before reaching the final panel of that chapter, we're actually thrust into some inserted content of Tanjiro's spirit helpers happily showing his dream intruder to the kill switch. This is interesting because not only does this part happen much later on in the movie, but it also happens smack dab in the middle of chapter 58, a chapter that we normally wouldn't get to until later. Since we're mainly following the TV series though, let's talk about it right now. Before anything else though, it needs to be said that this part in the manga is fully explained by the manga-only narrator, so it's on the dream intruder to adapt those lines instead. It's not all said outright. This guy doesn't just openly narrate himself meeting these spirit sprites, nor do we even see his first encounter with them, but on the other hand, there are more of them in the anime, a total of 6 instead of the normal 4, one of which pieces out before reaching the spirit core. But as they say, quality over quantity, because the 3 remaining ones in the manga alone seem to be a little more snuggly with the dream intruder, which likely causes him to say one manga-only line wishing that he could stay here. But whether he wants to or not, he's about to be forced out regardless, as the final panel of chapter 57 gets adapted again and a rift opens up in Tanjiro's realm of the subconscious. This is the part that the movie never adapted, and it shows how one of the spirits rescued this man on his way out of the dream world. Something the anime didn't say though is how this sprite became a permanent resident of this boy's soul, though it is heavily implied later. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, because after the opening airs, we're instead going to go back in time a little bit to start adapting some of the parts from chapter 57 that UfoTable skipped over last episode. Parts that have actually already been told in the movie by this point. Most of this goofy little bit is pretty much the same, but I do want to point out that in this panel here, it's kinda hard to tell who's actually saying this line. Viz Media chose Inosuke, but it's clearly the girl saying this in the anime, as she has one extra line in that version calling him a stupid bore afterwards, all while vigorously crab walking her way to safety. The anime alone actually shows that she did manage to Superman her way out of this tunnel, but not without Inosuke being very close by. It's that harrowing sight that transitions us pretty well into the second forgotten part of chapter 57. This guy making his way through Zenitsu's death trap actually houses some lines that were never adapted from the manga while Zenitsu stalks his victim. We actually don't get to see Zenitsu until the last moment in the manga, but in the anime we get some extra eccentric pose work from him before he asks his intruder about free real estate. He even takes a bonus cut at him here now, as well as use some anime-only mirage techniques afterwards. These are the techniques he'll use after this guy starts running away, and some anime-only lines of Zenitsu asking where Nezuko is will lead us into the psychotic googly-eyed charge that'll annihilate this man's wardrobe. While no such derobing happens in the manga, we do unfortunately miss out on some narration here. Apparently it's not common for dreamers to exist in their realm of the subconscious, but for extra strong personalities like Zenitsu and Inosuke, this is an exception. It's become a bout of mental warfare at this point, and just from the TV series exclusive shots of the battle ensuing from outside, it's pretty easy to tell who's winning. Not Tanjiro though, because he's about to off himself for the 3rd time now. To be fair though, these are new cuts exclusive to the TV version, and it actually shows how Tanjiro silently plops to the ground afterwards. Not sure why though, because according to the beginning of chapter 58 that we can finally start covering properly, Tanjiro went out screaming, and those screams became a part of his screams in reality. Either way, it was enough to startle Nezuko as she took cover behind the handrail. She may still have done this because of Tanjiro's loud voice, but based on how she covers her head in the anime alone, I feel like she's still getting over her trauma of headbutts. We don't really get this depiction in the manga because unlike the anime, Tanjiro never got the chance to get up close to Nezuko. He's instead distracted by the burnt off rope before he can. See, in the anime, the first thing Tanjiro notices after Nezuko is his sleeping teammates, but in the manga, he only notices them after he examines the rope and his ticket. I'm glad UfoTable did this because it's only natural that Tanjiro would focus on his friends first and foremost. Save the deduction skills for later. That being said, we do miss out on a couple of depictions from the manga, like how he goes for his sword immediately after seeing his friends, or how he picked up one of the dream intruder's hands to get a closer look at the rope before deciding not to cut it. Thankfully he decided not to, and that would be better to use Nezuko's blood art instead. A wise call, because as stated by the manga-only narrator, if Tanjiro did cut these ropes, all the dream intruder's consciousness would get severed and they'd never wake up again. Apparently Enmu knew this, and it was yet another reason why he didn't do this dream infiltration himself. So after we see Nezuko burn all the ropes, with the exception of Rengoku that the anime oddly doesn't show, Tanjiro starts furiously desperately trying to wake up Zenitsu and Inosuke. Even more vigorously in the anime too, with some more jostling and exclamatory lines. Such an aggressively caring person. Gotta love how Tanjiro apologizes to Nezuko for being too loud and then immediately raises his voice again. He was so loud he even woke up Rengoku's dream intruder. Looks like she didn't choke to death after all. That's nice. Actually, this brings up an interesting point, because in this vacant manga panel of her getting up, as well as the shot in the anime of her standing there after attacking, it appears that Rengoku is oddly sitting down now. My guess is that Tanjiro eased this girl out of Rengoku's death grip off screen and gently sat them both back down while Nezuko was burning away the ropes. UfoTable probably didn't want to pay too much attention to this fact though, since they didn't even adapt the panel of Nezuko burning Rengoku's rope, but I kinda get it. He is further away from his seat in the anime after all, and watching Tanjiro carry Rengoku around would have been a little too amusing to watch. Anyways, once this rope was burned, this girl was bound to attack anyway, but instead of cornering Tanjiro and Nezuko by their seats, the anime instead had Tanjiro pull Nezuko into the aisle instead, where the remainder of this scene will play out. The scene where all the other dream intruders wake up, still desperate to kill at least one of them so that they can have happy dreams themselves. All except for one, the boy that was tied to Tanjiro's dream, who we're just now learning has tuberculosis, a disease that unfortunately wasn't curable back in the Taisho era and has an extremely high mortality rate. Not only that, but it's a slow and drawn out death that leads to a lot of pain along the way, so it makes sense why this guy went to the lengths he did just to get some relief. In the manga, this is generally about the time we learn about what happened with this guy in Tanjiro's realm of the subconscious, but aside from some more narration we'll cover in a bit, we largely covered this part already. So now we'll skip to the end of page 13 where Tanjiro apologizes to the four of them for what he's about to do. And not that it matters much, but he actually knocked them out in a different order this time, instead leaving Rengoku's dream intruder for last, giving her some extra time to start panicking before falling flat on her face. As funny as that was though, it would have been nice if he gently put them down like he does in the manga so that they don't stab themselves with those picks on the way down. Don't get me wrong though, he's still sympathetic with these people even if they wanted to hurt him and his friends. He even has an anime only line here saying that it would be nice if this current reality was the dream world while remembering his lost family one more time. Fortunately for you Tanjiro, you still have Nezuko, as the anime now shows her running up to give him a big ol' hug. After that is when we get into the internal monologue of Tanjiro's dream intruder, and for those of you who watched the TV series versus movie comparison video, you'd know that this part is a tad jumbled, and it's doubly so here, so let's run through this as meticulously as possible. Okay, so for starters, there is no internal monologue in the manga, and that's because everything that needed to be said was already told by the narrator when he was narrating the part of the dream intruder's excursion through Tanjiro's dream core, a part that the TV series has already covered most of, but the movie version has covered none of. Let's start with the TV version. As we all know, the beginning of this episode outlined the dream intruder's time in the realm of the subconscious pretty well, but during that time the dream intruder didn't adapt all of the narrator's words. The only part that he left out is where he said he was prepared to hurt others to get away from his illness and the like, so he'll adapt that narration here while we get a recap of him falling out of the dream world again. So he didn't say these words during his time in the subconscious world, rather he said them while he was narrating what he's already been through. As for the movie, these words are kind of there, but with some revised phrasing, likely because it's split up both before and after the scene of the dream intruder trekking along with the spirit sprites, something the movie is just now adapting for the first time. It may not adapt the part at the end where he falls into the hole, but it does adapt some narration that the TV series didn't. See, in the movie version, the dream intruder says outright that the little sprites lit up his heart, whereas in the TV version, it's not really said in its entirety, rather it's just shown with that new scene. Like I said much earlier, both versions hint at this, but never fully clarify that this sprite is now a permanent resident of this boy's heart. Tanjiro really had an impact on this man, and after he takes off with Nezuko, the manga-only narrator actually touches up on this influence a little bit more. In this manga-only explanation, he said that dream infiltrators are susceptible to influence by the dreamer. This guy is pretty lucky that he got paired up with such a kind-hearted person, but it could have also gone the other way around, and this is just another reason why Enmu doesn't enter other people's dreams. I have to admit, it'd be kinda nice to know what became of this guy. He likely doesn't have much time left to live, but whatever he does with his remaining days, I'm sure he'll be content. Now we've reached the turning point in the Mugen Train arc, because pretty much everything from here on out will be pure action. As usual, this is where we'll start focusing more on animation breakdown territory, as a lot of the choreography of UfoTable's work is largely disconnected from the manga. Don't worry, a lot of key actions are still in there, like how Tanjiro flips his way onto the roof, leaving Nezuko behind to confront the demon responsible for all this sleep paralysis. But before all that happens, it's about that time for the commercial break cut screens. The first commercial break cut screen comes from the title page of Chapter 59, and the second comes from Chapter 60's title page. We're not going to cover Chapter 60 today, but we're literally one page away from covering Chapter 59. The only thing that's left on Chapter 58 is some taunting from Enmu, where the anime adds in one line of him saying that showing a nightmare would have been a little too stressful for Tanjiro before bringing up his father. It's Tanjiro's reaction to that offhand comment that'll end out Chapter 58. Now on Chapter 59, we start off with Enmu explaining his sick pastimes to the audience. And for the most part, this descriptive sequence is the same, but we do get some additional imagery in the anime of Enmu's previous Mugen train activities. Really horrendous stuff. It's worth pointing out though that the movie didn't originally adapt all of these lines by Enmu. The part of him talking about how difficult it was to set up his whole ticket scheme was left out in the movie version, but luckily was fully adapted for the TV release. All this stuff is still said in Enmu's head, but weirdly enough, the anime does have him say his last couple words out loud. It's at that point that Tanjiro finally decides to draw his sword, and that was the exact pose work Enmu needed to realize that this is the boy that Muzan wanted him to go after. He seems pretty chill about this realization in the manga, but in the anime he literally throws his arms up in the air, he's so happy. It makes sense, he knows that this kid could be the ticket, no pun intended, to procuring an upper rank spot. Hate to break it to you man, but the demons in that rank are far beyond anything you could achieve. Taking on Tanjiro will already be a handful for you, as this guy just activated his 10th form, water breathing, constant flux. I've covered Tanjiro's water breathing pretty extensively during my coverage of the district arc, so I won't get too into detail about the effect work here, but I will point out a few key things along the way, like the methodical process on how UfoTable got this water trail to gradually envelop the frame. It's really well done. Our focus is usually on Tanjiro and his blade, so that as the blade circles around in a hypnotic fashion, we don't even notice how the water effects he's leaving behind start morphing into a water trail. It starts off kinda disjointed, but it all jerks its way into linearity at the same time Tanjiro whips into his final stance. But that's not where the trail stops, because after we switch to a front-facing shot and two random blades of water hit us in the face, we can see that that trail is slowly increasing its radius until that too hits us in the face and we move to the last cut of the dragon face forming at the tip of the trail. That dragon is pretty cool, but I'm actually more satisfied with how its surrounding composition eases us into the next cut without any interruption. It's not overbearing, but it still gives us the full picture of what the final form of this dragon looks like. Honestly, UfoTable probably could have gotten away with a full CGI dragon with how hyper-realistic the one from the manga looks, but I appreciate UfoTable staying consistent with how they've animated Tanjiro's water breathing up to this point. The key animation mixed with CG particles is a tried and true formula after all. Something we haven't seen before though is how Enmu's sleep attacks are tackled. Strictly speaking, this should be an unseen attack, but thanks to some digital effects, this attack doesn't feel as material as some of the other Blood Demon arts we've seen up until now, and it should be that way. Slowing it down, you can really see it isn't that different from UfoTable's other effects, but what is different is the warping of the picture as a whole once it explodes. A fun little touch for a demon that excels at warping people's cognitions. UfoTable also has a little more fun with some color inversion properties once the attack hits Tanjiro's face for the first time, but for pretty much every other attack, this digital warping effect as well as some classic anime airstreak effects is basically all Enmu's attacks amount to. Just like the manga, it takes Enmu trying this sleep attack 6 times before realizing that Tanjiro has successfully countered it. But what is different here is that Tanjiro seems to have gained a little more speed for the anime adaptation. Scratch that, a lot more speed, because in the anime, Enmu now has to actually start jumping around while throwing sleep attacks. And after he realizes that Tanjiro is countering it, that's when he starts throwing more than in the manga. What this means is that UfoTable literally made up a fight where there kind of originally wasn't one. Tanjiro just runs in a straight line in the manga, enduring the sleep attacks until he eventually wobbles his way to Enmu's neck. And that's the only attack he does in the manga, but in the anime, he's swinging around like mad trying to catch Enmu. Tanjiro still does get consistently staggered by Enmu, but I like how his water breathing dissipates even if he's using it during that time. He does attack a lot more in the anime, so it does make sense that he wouldn't waste energy on a new form every single time he wakes up. Naturally, this means there isn't a consistent amount of effect work coming from Tanjiro's end, so to make up for that, UfoTable focuses mainly on synchronizing their camera movement and their pose-to-pose work. They really are the best in the industry when it comes to these two things. The well thought out layouts of these shots perfectly sets up the extreme wind lined up posing, and the execution of these moves and attacks transitions seamlessly from one cut to the next, making it incredibly easy to follow. On top of which, the zooming and panoramic nature of these cuts gives us a greater scale of reference to discern how the battle is actually progressing. Of course, it goes without saying that effect work is UfoTable's true bread and butter, but they're no slouch when it comes to exercising dynamicism through other means. This final shot of Tanjiro here really is the accumulation of all of UfoTable's prowess combined. From the focus on the weighty pose work of Tanjiro stomping forward aided by the low-bearing camera angle in the beginning, to the focus on how the water effects react to the turning motions of Tanjiro's body at the end. It's balanced so well, and throughout it all you really get the sense that Tanjiro is getting used to Enmu's sleep attack more and more. Enmu knows this well too though, so instead of getting Tanjiro to stay asleep, he decides to traumatize him instead by giving him a nightmare. Well, multiple nightmares actually. See, in the manga alone, the narrator outlines that Enmu showed Tanjiro a nightmare of his family criticizing him, which may or may not have been housed in one singular nightmare. But in the anime, there's no question at all that different family members were split into different nightmare sequences, as not only does the layout change when we cut away, but it's aided by the same distortion and audio effects that triggered when Tanjiro broke out of his first dream. Really the main difference here though is how those different layouts are tackled. The dialogue housed within is still basically the same, but everything now feels far more corporeal, as instead of everyone standing in a black void, family members interact with Tanjiro on a physical level, pushing him around, clinging to him, throwing stuff at him, and even going so far as to show him the same night when his family was murdered, except his mom is behind him holding Rokta. It gives Tanjiro a real place in these nightmares and gives the audience a real sense of dread, especially with how UfoTable composed these scenes. For example, when this nightmare began, we were greeted with a cut taken from episode 2, and besides the snow that's obviously been redone, you can really feel the impact that simple color grading and film grain can do for a scene. I like how there's a clear distinction between the background art and the characters, and even between Tanjiro and his family, as he's the most monochromatic one of them all. He's not stained with blood after all, but even when comparing him with his father, his haori isn't red like his father's. There's different shades here and there, but the only real red part coming from Tanjiro is his eyes, probably because of how pissed off he is at Enmu right now. We don't need a narrator to tell us that, because when we get back into reality, Tanjiro's already got another form ready, and it's the attack that'll finally make contact with Enmu's neck. Again, this is the only attack Tanjiro threw in the manga, and it looks pretty cool in how the dragon tail dissolves out of Tanjiro's blade, but the anime actually took it a step further, literally, by making Tanjiro jump extra high into the air and spin around for a drop-down attack. And from there, of course, we get the execution itself. It was a pretty clean slash in the manga, but I appreciate the two-hit attack UfoTable did a little more, as his blade now stops when it connects with Enmu's neck, and the slash only follows through when the water dragon comes in to get the extra force he needed to decapitate him. Extra force or not though, this was still a little too easy for comfort for Tanjiro, and that paranoia shows quite well in the manga. The anime, on the other hand, decided to show Tanjiro in a far more badass light, with him looking forward much longer for dramatic effect. As such, the sequence of events here have been lengthened, as Tanjiro only looks back at Enmu's head after it hits the roof of the train. Something that, as far as I'm aware, didn't happen in the manga, as in it Tanjiro runs through his little internal monologue while Enmu's head is still in the air, and only after Tanjiro is done thinking do we see that gross tentacle thing is already holding Enmu's head up. And speaking of that tentacle, it looks a lot smaller than the one from the anime. It also didn't have a gross pulsating reveal like the anime did. Its appearance is a lot less veiny and a lot more goopy looking. This is one of the more obvious bouts of CGI UfoTable has employed, but by no means does it look bad, at least in my opinion. The keying of Enmu's face matches pretty well with it, and it even rotates along with the tentacle. Getting the two to sync in a meaningful way is something that might seem like it's more trouble than it's worth, but keep in mind, if everything here was attempted traditionally, the goop from the tentacle would cause a consistency error when compared to the CGI goop that's shown frequently throughout the next episode. And in that episode, CGI is much more of a necessity. We'll talk about that next time, but for now, how does this sequence compare to the manga? Well, there really isn't too much to say here. The dialogue is basically the same, with only a couple of extra cackles from Enmu. And not only that, even most of the camera angles from the manga were brought over unaltered, something that UfoTable usually does sparingly. After Tanjiro attacks and Enmu sinks back into the train, leaving behind UfoTable's favorite swirly CGI effects, Tanjiro now has to figure out what his next plan of attack is. He knows he can't do it alone, and in the anime he seems to realize this fact a tad later than usual, as he doesn't start running until after he starts calling for his demon Demon Slayer compatriots. Only after that does he call for Nezuko's help, who as we can see has been working quite diligently this whole time. This shot of Nezuko burning away her friends isn't actually shown in the manga, so now we can say with 100% certainty that we have Nezuko to thank for Inosuke's awakening. And boy, he's so excited to be awake that he even puts a few extra dents in the roof before bursting through it and then jumping right back into it for some reason. Okay, so this part is a little weird because right as he jumps out of the train, this is where chapter 59 ends, and by all means so should the episode, but I guess UfoTable wanted to end it on a little more of a bang by adapting some of the pages on chapter 60 instead. Pages that normally would come after Tanjiro gives the rundown to Inosuke. In the next episode, this part will be adapted again, and a little more properly, so as much as I'd love to break down Inosuke's sick acrobatic Sakuga, it'd be better if we saved that for next time. Cause boy oh boy, there's a lot of action to cover. Until that day comes, I hope you all enjoyed this video, and if you really did like it, it would mean the world to me if you could support me by liking, sharing, and subscribing for more manga comparisons and animation breakdowns. Also, I'd like to give a special shout out to my patrons who've helped keep me afloat the past month. Despite being radio silent for a while, you all stayed by me, and words can't describe just how thankful I am for that. You all have my sincerest thanks. Well, that's it for me. As always, I hope you all have a fantastic day. This is Registry, signing off.